Well, hello everyone. This is Mel here. I have a new guest, Mohammed, and he's going to be looking at the history of the Quran. Welcome, Mohammed.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to your
It,
channel.
my pleasure. Would you like to tell people a little bit about yourself to the extent that you're free to do so?
Yeah, my name is Mohammed Al Firas. I've been researching Quranic manuscripts and the history of the Quran for a few years now. I can't say I'm an expert, but I think I know a bit to have a discussion on the subject.
Excellent. Um, can I say that you are from the Middle East?
Uh, yeah, but I was born in the UK and I moved here afterwards.
Oh, okay, all right. Um, okay, so I'm going to hand it over to you, and we can have a discussion as we go along. Do you want me to challenge any points as we go along, or how
Yeah,
would
yeah,
you
I
like to
think
do?
I think you should challenge or ask questions, especially if things are unclear or you disagree with something. It would be good to engage.
Yeah. Now, I will say, I'll put my hand up. This is not an area that I know much about. It's
Yeah,
like
that's fine as long as you are able to, think.
I'm I'm spread.
Yeah,
I'm kind of spread thin because I'm looking at like 101 things, but and this is like I'm sure you found like studying this. This takes a lot of time and effort just to get to grips with this. Like you could put
yeah. So I
hours.
just hope for this to be like an introductory to the subject
Yeah,
and like to introduce people to why the arguments people make for the collection of the Quran, for example,
yeah.
um, and other manuscript stuff. It's just a basic introduction.
Okay. So hand it over to you.
Okay. Yeah. So okay, so according to the Muslim tradition, the Quran wasn't collected during the Prophet's lifetime. That happened during the reign of Abu Bakr. So within 2 or so years after the Prophet's death, the Quran was already collected in the form of codex. But this text wasn't distributed. It seems to have been like a personal collection of the Quran, um, made just so that the text can be preserved because many reciters were lost during the Battle of Yamama. So, yeah, the purpose of this initial collection by Abu Bakr was to ensure the preservation of the text. So, after this, variant codices continued to circulate, like, Ibn Mas'ud's codex, Ubay bin Ka'b's, and other companions. And people started to disagree with one another.
Mhm.
They would reject each other's readings, and this caused a lot of friction between the early Muslim community. So Uthman, when he learned about this, he called for the standardization of the text. This is the traditional perspective.
Yeah.
Uh, and so after Uthman's standardization, the text was basically uniform. Uh, any codices that disagreed with it were ordered to be destroyed. There are some, indications that in Kufa, for example, Ibn Mas'ud's tradition survived for a while.
Mhm.
So variant readings weren't completely eradicated after the standardization, but for the most part, Uthman's collection was successful. People had to adhere to his codex, and after the Uthmanic standardization, we see a lot of manuscripts that basically follow today's text.
Yeah.
But I'm going to say something.
Yeah. There there are kind of there is a lively debate about whether the standardization occurred under Uthman or not.
Yeah,
Um,
I know. I
uh,
was good.
I'm kind of leaning towards Abdul Al Malik. I do recognize that there was elements from earlier that they've gathered, but where do you sit on all of that?
Yeah, I think that the Uthmanic standardization is a real historical fact. And
Okay.
Abdel Malik, he did something, of course, he did something, but it was probably something minor. And
Oh,
I hope to discuss this. I hope to, try and present my arguments or other people's arguments for the historicity of the Uthmanic collection in this presentation.
okay, good. All right.
So basically, scholars have made a few arguments. They can be summed up in 2 points. One is the unanimity of the Uthmanic tradition. Everyone, whether you're Shia or Sunni or if you hated Uthman or if you loved Uthman, they agreed that it was Uthman who standardized the text. They traced the text to Uthman alone. Some people have pointed out some flaws in this. I don't know if you're familiar with Stephen Shoemaker's new book.
Yes, I've read it. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so he points out some flaws. I don't really agree with his the problems that he points out, because he points to stuff like the report, the Uthmanic report. There are apparently some contradictions within the report. Some of them say that Abu Bakr collected the Quran with and no involvement of Umar, or the other way around. But that is concerning the first collection by Abu Bakr.
yeah.
And even those kind of contradictions can be easily explained. Not much information was known about Abu Bakr's collection, so people were really just guessing about the details. But with Uthman's collection, I think it's pretty solid. Everyone did trace the text to Uthman. There's no indication in those reports that people were tracing the standard text that we have today to anyone other than Uthman.
Hmm. Okay, I'm going to push back a little bit on this, while respecting difference of opinion. My impression is that, and this is Stephen Shoemaker's argument, is that there was an incentive to push it back, that the standardization needs to be pushed back to the time of Uthman to be within the lifetime of the key participants to make the text more credible. And there are parallel stories, like there's a lot of similarities between the way it was collected under Abdul Malik and under Uthman. How would you respond to that kind of line of argument?
If you rely on the traditions, our main source for information on either of their collections are the Islamic tradition. For Abdul Malik's, we have some, slight references in the non-Muslim literature. There's like 2 or 3 sources, but all they do is just mention that Hajjaj did something. They don't describe, his collection, and they don't actually say that Uthman did nothing. I think 2 of them, there are only 3 sources, 2 of them actually mention Uthman's role as well. So what the non-Muslim sources seem to be inferring is that Hajjaj did something. This could be anything. But of course, they attribute it to major significant changes that happened under Abdul Malik.
Yeah. What do you make of the comment that it was under Al-Hajjaj that the reading of the Quran occurred in mosques, that it didn't occur prior to that? For me, that would be an argument for a late collection of the Quran, because why wouldn't they read from the Quran earlier? What do you think? Is that just like a false narrative, do you think, or is there another explanation?
Yeah, I think I remember hearing that is a misunderstanding of a report, but I don't really remember the report in order to refute that.
Okay,
right?
No problem.
But yeah, so and the second main argument is manuscripts, and this is probably more important. This is more convincing. There are a couple of manuscripts that contain large portions of the Quran that are getting dated to the 7th century. And so there are a couple of ways you can date manuscript. Actually, there are only like two or three ways. The first is, of course, writing style, paleography, and the second is carbon dating. And in Shoemaker's book, he sort of undermines the validity or reliability of carbon dating. So we'll keep this discussion to the writing style and part of manuscripts.
Cool.
So, yeah. When you look at early manuscripts, the main problem is you don't have dates for them. They're undated. A couple of manuscripts have been attributed to Uthman or Ali, but these are generally later. If you look at their writing style, they probably can't be as early as the time of Uthman or Ali. But this shouldn't distract us from the fact that there are a couple of manuscripts that are datable to the 7th century, on whether you're looking at the writing style or carbon dating. And so the earliest script we have for the manuscripts is the Hijazi script. And it's basically characterized by the fact that the letters slant to the right. So if you see over here, this is an example of an alif. It is slanting to the right instead of being vertical.
Yeah.
And within the Hijazi scripts, there are many, different writing styles, but more or less they agree with this characterization. And the earliest stage of paleography, the scripts are not uniform. They're not uniform, and some people wouldn't think that this is that nice to look at. If you look at the Kufic manuscripts, which are later, they are more appealing to the eye, and they are more regular, which we'll see later.
Yeah.
So one example of the Hijazi manuscript is the Petropolitan codex. And it's an important codex because it attests roughly 45% of the Quran's text. And 5 scribes were involved in the transcription of this manuscript. And on the basis of some of the features in this manuscript, Deroshi dates it to between 671 and 695. This is because, you have some manuscripts which we can identify as datable to the reign of Uthmanic. And these manuscripts are more sophisticated. They have more reformed spellings, and they have a more reformed script style, a more regular and more appealing script style. But here, in the earliest stages, the spelling is still it still uses old spellings, which we'll see after this. And also the writing style is sufficiently early to be datable to between this period.
Yeah.
And of course, the text mostly conforms almost perfectly to the we have today, with the exception of a few scribal errors. So
just one tiny little pushback. I heard Robert Kerr mention that the idea, of the script styles that one starts and then followed by another. He would argue that some of these scripts happen parallel to each other, so it's very hard. If you see,
that's
Kufic and a Hijazi script could be coexistent. But
yes, that's actually correct. That's definitely correct.
I do think the spelling I do think the spelling one is a strong argument where it goes from old spelling to new spelling. Like that is much I think that's a better indicator. But yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, so it is true that multiple script styles exist at the same time. But I think most scholars, including Deroche, for example, he would consider Hijazi to be the earliest script. But this is still under debate, and more manuscripts and more inscriptions can get published that will help us provide a rough chronology. But basically, I think if you look at the script style, the basic argument is that this is quite irregular. This is quite not like the later Kufic scripts, which are more appealing to the eye.
Yeah.
Yeah. And those kind of script styles are generally recognized to be later. So this would probably, be. But again, you make a valid point, of course, that it's still possible that multiple script styles existed at the same time. And it's actually true. We do have one script style, which is not exactly like Hijazi. The alifs are vertical, but you can't exactly say it's Kufic either. And this script style, manuscript in this script style, have been carbon dated to like the mid 7th century. So some people might suggest that it's actually as early as the Hijazi script. But the basic idea is most likely that this Hijazi script is earlier than the Kufic scripts we see later on.
I would say just to push back a little bit on the carbon dating, because I used to think the carbon dating was useful for this, but according to Stephen Shoemaker, the range is quite large. It's about a century, from a date, so 50 years plus or minus. But each year within that is equally as likely. So you can't. It can say maybe. It could say that maybe it's in this particular century, possibly, depending on where you place it.
That would still bring us to the 7th century.
Possibly, or well, let's say it could potentially also give you the early part of the 8th century. That's the only thing. I don't think it's refined. It's not refined enough, but at least it gives you. At least okay, you're talking 7th or 8th century as opposed to, let's say, I don't know, 10th century. Let's say. But
Yeah,
that's
that yeah, that is correct. But I think
it's
the
helpful.
date
But
ranges yeah, it's helpful. But the date ranges we see sometimes are usually like 560 to 650 or something like that. So that roughly indicates that it's probably like, the mid 7th century or slightly after that, we can date the manuscript to. But yes, there are still some reservations we should have. Haitham Sidki is an example of a scholar who's working on carbon dating, and I think he defends the reliability of carbon dating in a paper which he hasn't published yet. So yeah,
yeah,
we'll have to wait.
yeah,
But for now, it's useful. But as most scholars note, it should be like a secondary way of dating manuscripts. The
yeah,
most important thing is the script style and the text itself, for example.
yeah, yeah. I think what would really be helpful if they ever find documents with dates on them with the particular writing style, so they could be 100% definite. Okay, this is now is the
Yeah.
earliest.
So basically,
That's what we
basically,
need, really.
Deroche, yeah, Deroche, the scholar here, he actually makes a similar argument to what you're suggesting. We
Yeah,
do have some documents or some inscriptions actually
yeah,
that have been dated, and
yeah.
they are very similar to the Quranic scripts, the
Okay.
scripts we see on manuscripts.
Yeah,
And I'm going to go through that after this.
yeah, yeah.
So the second example is the Sana palimpsest. Again, it attests more than 40% of the Quran. Uh, it's a palimpsest, meaning that the lower text was erased and something was written over it. And in this case, both of them are Quranic. The lower text is a non-standard, non-Uthmanic codex, and it contains several minor variations when you compare it to the text that we have today. And the upper text follows the text we have today, the Uthmanic version, closely. Uh, yeah,
Can
so
I
the
can I
fact
ch-
that,
can I
yeah,
just give just an instance response? Does that not indicate an argument that actually what's underneath is more likely the earlier standardization rather than do you know what I'm saying? If we have what's his name Abu Bakr's collection, and then it was only with Uthman that there's another standard, and you have this text now, the Sana, which has um, an underlying text and an upper text. Surely the underlying would be the Uthmanic rather than an earlier text. Just
um, what do you mean?
so let's
Because
say
yeah,
so
we define Uthmanic text as basically the text we have today. And
okay, so
yeah,
he's so, but you see what I'm saying is right. So let's say you have text A and text B. Text B is the one underneath. That's the earlier one. Okay, and it's different from the one above, right?
yeah,
If there was a standardization and it's the same as the one today, more or less, give or take a few variations, okay? But there's an underlying text that would suggest that if we accept the Uthmanic standardization, surely that one that's underneath is more likely the Uthmanic standardization, because there was no collection. According to the tradition, there was no collection until Uthman brought together. Um,
uh,
no.
no, actually, according to the tradition, companions did collect the Quran. Companions did write the Quran, and they had their own collections. This
All right.
could
Okay.
represent that.
So the
Yeah,
idea is that this is just one of the companion collections rather than like
yes,
Abakars or something. Okay.
yeah, and we can't really identify it as Abu Bakr or Ibn Mas'ud or any specific companions because we don't actually have that much data about these
Hmm.
codices in the tradition itself,
Yeah.
especially Abu Bakr's codex. There's nothing that we know really about Abu Bakr's codex.
Yeah.
And we don't need to think of the manuscript, the palimpsest, in terms of standardization because we can't, if the lower text really is like an earlier text, we can't really assume that that was the one that was used in a standardization, in the Uthmanic standardization. We don't know where it was produced, we don't know who wrote it, and we don't even know when it was written.
Yeah.
Desroches, for example, he thinks the Sana lower text can be dated to the late 7th century, so after the Uthmanic standardization. As I told you before, in some places, non-standard codices continue to circulate. So this could be an example of that.
Okay.
Yeah. But the reason some people think it's probably predates the Uthmanic standardization is because of the early carbon dating and the fact that it's a non-standard codex. Because after Uthman standardized the Quran, it is assumed that very few people would be adhering to a non-standard codex. And there was a recent paper on the Sana palimpsest which shows that this codex was a complete Quran. It was a professional codex. It was written, I think, by at least 2 scribes who collaborated in the production of this manuscript. So yeah.
Excellent.
And so now we get to the part where we can roughly identify a date range for these specific scripts. So here is a Kufic script, Kufic B-Wad script. There are many different types of Kufic scripts, but this is the most important, one of the most important because it's the earliest stage. It's basically it's more as you can see, it's kind of regular. It's more regular than your Hijazi script, which is kind of messy. Like here, you have a more or less uniform pattern. But if you look at Hijazi scripts, 2 different Hijazi manuscripts, the writing style is going to be completely different. It's still going to start to the right, but the letter shapes and all are not going to be consistent with one another.
Yeah, they're still trying to work out. They're still trying to work out a consistent style, maybe.
Yes. Yeah. So people think that Abdul Malik is the one who more or less established a standard sort of script style. After his time, people started to adhere to a uniform script style. But this isn't that script. We don't know yet. But there is an inscription, actually 2 or 3 inscriptions, which were found in Mecca, dated to the year 80, which are written in this script that we saw here, or a very, very similar script. There are similarities. And that's significant because you can, give a rough date range for these manuscripts.
Yeah.
So, and the Hijazi scripts are probably earlier than this. So we can roughly say that it was, produced within the 7th century. Of course, it's not completely accurate. We can't say that this was produced in the year 80 or 85. It could be like around that range. But I think we can safely rule out like a mid-8th century date for these manuscripts because of this this finding.
Now, the only thing I would say about that inscription in Mecca is there is a possibility that might be a forgery. It would need to be checked. Like when did it first appear? But assuming that's all legit and that it hasn't been just the work of a forger that produced it in the last 50 years or something, but presuming it's all legit and so forth, but it does look,
of course,
it does look legit from the little I can tell. I would need to look further into it, but
but there are quite a few. There are like 2 or 3 inscriptions, all written by the same person, and it's geographically distributed. It's not. I don't think it's found at the exact same place.
Okay.
So perhaps that's an indication for its authenticity. Of course, yes, the inscriptions need to be published. I think these inscriptions have been published.
They have,
where it was published, but
yeah, it would be good.
Modern scholars.
It'd be good to get maybe afterwards we get a link to where it was published so that we can look into it further, because that's definitely a very key piece of data there.
I think Deroshi discusses it in one of his works. I can find a reference and share it with you later.
Yeah, thank you.
And the final script we'll discuss, this is the one that can be associated with Abdul Malik's inscriptions, the so-called OI script. So if you look at Abdul Malik's inscriptions, there are quite a few similarities between this manuscript and the inscriptions in terms of how the letters are written, basically the writing style. So if you read here, the 3 manuscripts also share a distinctive final lam, ya, qaf, and kaf, which find their closest parallel at the same monument and in the milestones of Abdul Malik. Taken as a whole, the underlying combination of the script and decoration directly mirrors that of the Dome of the Rock.
Okay, that's good. I like the fact that you're referring to the milestones, because I think they are a good piece of evidence, because they were buried for centuries, and so I think they are definitely authentic, just simply because they were buried and they fit within the time and so forth. So I think that's an excellent piece of evidence that you've got
Yeah,
there.
yeah, and the next slide basically shows some of these examples of how the letter shapes are similar. Uh, so these are basically the manuscript we saw earlier, and this is Abdul Malik's inscriptions, the letter shapes.
Okay, right. That's excellent. Yeah, yeah. I can definitely see the similarity. It's so if so number four is Abdul Malik's, and the three, two, and one are the those manuscripts that you showed earlier.
Yeah, it's just one manuscript, but the thing is, Desroches has actually identified two or three other manuscripts written in the same script.
Yeah.
That is why he considers this to be solidly attributable to Abdul Malik's time.
Okay.
He
Excellent.
actually uses this manuscript to date the Parisino Codex, because one of the five scribes that was involved in the Paris Codex,
Yeah.
it has some similarities with this codex we see here, but it's not as sophisticated.
Yeah.
And the orthography is also, like I said, the spelling is
Yeah.
not as advanced. So that led Desroches to date it to earlier than Abdul Malik.
Yeah. Now, as far as I understand from various papers I've read, the spelling didn't really get properly consistent across the board for centuries. So, it's
Yeah,
a good
I'll
argument.
discuss that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll discuss spelling variations next.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So here,
Oh, here.
orthography. So
Yeah.
yeah, the earliest manuscripts, if you compare it to today's text, there are going to be a lot of spelling variations.
Yeah.
And it's true that you can't really say that it was after Abdul Malik's time, all the spelling variations stopped. You can't really say that. But there are specific spellings which became much more common after Abdul Malik's time. And the main thing we can actually associate with Abdul Malik maybe is the spelling of the word qala specifically.
Hmm.
So in the earliest manuscripts, if you look at it, it will probably be spelled like this: qaf and lam without the alif.
Okay.
But today it would be spelled like this. Yeah, so it's a very insignificant difference. But if you look at the manuscripts, which based on writing style, you might consider them to be from the 7th century, like this manuscript here. And if you compare that to later manuscripts, for example, from the 8th century or the mid 8th century specifically, you will notice that they stop having uh, this spelling, and it's almost always this spelling.
That's
But I
good.
think,
Okay. Yeah, that's a nice piece. Yeah, to
yeah,
identify it. Yeah, that's good.
there are other words, like for example, the word shay, which means thing.
Yeah.
It can be spelled with an alif, like this. But this spelling, however, we can't really say that in the 8th century it stops. It probably stops towards the end of the 8th century. Like in the beginning of the 9th century, you don't see this spelling anymore. You don't see the one with the alif.
Yeah.
But yeah, but so this is not really a strong, you can't really point to this orthographic difference. But
Yeah.
this one is slightly more convincing. You do
Yeah.
see Paula, the word Paula, 7th century manuscripts generally seem to have this spelling, and this spelling generally appears later.
Yeah. I would say that if you were to try and date a document, you would probably use a collection of different examples to build a case for a particular decade or year. Presumably, it'd be a decade. So you know, you would look for like a range of different type of spellings to narrow it down the dating. Would that be right?
Yeah,
That would.
yeah, that is correct.
Yeah.
Desroches, I think in his work on it's a book called The Qur'ans of the Umayyads, he basically selects five different words to choose from, and
Mhm.
he looks at how the percentage in each manuscript, which spelling it has.
Yeah.
The earlier, again, this is probably the most consistent of the five. He also uses the second one,
Yeah.
Shay. Yeah, this one is not really showing a good pattern between the 7th and 8th century,
Yeah.
but this one does. Paula does.
Yeah. So what you can what you can
Yeah.
argue for is a statistical probability in terms of your dating,
Yeah.
essentially.
Now, it doesn't have to be that, Abdul Malik introduced this spelling.
Yeah,
It doesn't have to be. I mean, like, this spelling already existed by the mid-7th century.
yeah,
It's just that in Quranic manuscripts, it only appears slightly later.
yeah,
Yeah. And yeah, so, but there is also another way you can use the spelling variations in manuscripts to argue for an early codification of the Quran. So that's what Van Putten has done in a recent paper. He has shown that, the phrase ni'mat Allah and similar phrases, it's not just one phrase, it can be spelled with a ta and a ta marbuta. And it's in a random pattern. If you look at all the instances of this phrase in today's text, it's in a random pattern, the
yeah,
spelling.
yeah,
And early manuscripts, if you look at early manuscripts, it has the same pattern or a very, very similar pattern. And it's consistent with one another. That same pattern appears in multiple manuscripts. So that's an indication that all these manuscripts trace back to a written archetype, a
yeah.
written original text. Now,
Hmm.
this doesn't exactly prove the Uthmanic standardization. It proves that there was an original written copy.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
why do we associate it with Uthman? It's because it appears in manuscripts which are sufficiently early,
hmm,
like the Paris Codex that Desroches had studied.
yeah,
Desroches had dated this to the third quarter of the first century, right before Abdul Malik's reign.
hmm,
So it would be consistent with a standardization by Uthman. Of course, you can't really rule out Muawiyah or Ali, for example, uh, just based on this data, but it's a good indication. If it wasn't Abdul Malik, we don't really have evidence that suggests Muawiyah or anyone else other than Uthman collected the Quran. And you can also use the carbon dating, but like you said, there are some problems with using that for now.
yeah.
But it's still a good indication. And it also shows another point that early manuscripts adhere closely to the text we have today. We wouldn't see this pattern if, scribes felt that they could change the text. If these scribes were actively changing the Quran, why would they adhere to this kind of random pattern?
Yeah,
It also
especially if,
says,
yeah,
yeah,
like the temptation for a scribe would be to say, okay, this is the correct spelling. Now let's keep it consistent right through the
yeah,
manuscript.
exactly.
Like Surah 2 in particular has more archaic spelling in comparison to other surahs, but you can see that they've
Yeah,
kept it.
those claims need to be examined when you look at early manuscripts. I don't know about any specific things which are specific to Surah 2 alone in terms of spellings.
Well, I can think of one offhand, which is the spelling of Abraham.
Wahi? Yes.
So
The thing is,
it's
another
spelled
paper,
more. It just spelled more like a Aramaic type of spelling as opposed to a more, say, typical later
right?
Arabic type of spelling. Whereas in
Yeah.
the same name elsewhere in the Quran would be spelt like Ibrahim, whereas in Surah 2 it tends to, I don't know if it's 100%, but like it tends to be the older spelling anyway.
Right, yeah. So I'll just briefly explain that issue. So
Yeah.
in the Quran that we have today, you have two spellings. One is Ibrahim without a ya, and the second is Ibrahim with a ya. So in today's text, this appears only in Surah 2. That is correct. But that pattern does not show up in early manuscripts. That's what Van Putten showed in another paper. It's actually much more random. So you can't specifically say that Surah 2 is more archaic in terms of that.
So are you saying that the later spelling was in Surah 2 in earlier manuscripts, or are you saying it was much
No,
more
no, no. I'm
random?
saying that there's nothing to say that it's Surah 2 specifically that had this.
Oh
Surah
no,
2 can have,
I don't mean exclusively. I'm just saying in terms of it's more prominent, let's say in Surah 2. I think that's what I've read in various papers.
no, the claim is that it's true. If you look at today's mushafs, this spelling only appears in Surah 2. This spelling only appears in Surah Al-Baqarah. But the truth is that pattern does not show up in manuscripts. Manuscripts, it's much more random.